let's do a little water talking here. We got a lot of stuff happening on these farms. It seems like every time we turn around, we are fighting another fire. But when it comes to water quality, a lot of times we are missing it. There are 6 issues with these animals that are most commonly associated with water. High mortality, enteric issues, poor performance. You're seeing disease grow out after grow out. You can't seem to get them well. Low vaccination effect and low water consumption. All of these can be related to your water issues, and we spend a lot of time fighting everywhere else on that farm trying to take care of these problems. And a lot of times, I can say with confidence, about 70% of the time, the problem is in your water. It may not have started in your water. It may have started somewhere else in that facility. But anything that's floating around in that facility can wind up in your water lines. And you might get it cleaned up on the outside. You might get the floors cleaned up. You may get that ventilation system cleaned up. But you hadn't cleaned that water system yet. And that's where it's waiting for you. Dependence on water increases for these animals when they have diets that are high in salt, when those sows are lactating, when the ambient temperature is high, and there's an increase in crude protein in the diet. And one of the most crucial points of this, when they increase that water consumption, is when that pig is sick and he has fever or diarrhea. And he's trying to drink more water, and actually the problem is coming from the water. And so we are just exacerbating the issue by not keeping this line clean. So when we talk about water quality, what exactly are we talking about? I've divided it up in 3 different areas for you to kind of get you, so you can think about as a category what you're dealing with in that water. Minerals. Those are often overlooked because we can't see most of them, but it affects a lot of areas of quality. Bacteria. That can make the pig sick. Y'all know that. It chokes down that water pipe size. You're trying to get water to this animal as he gets bigger and he can't get enough water. Fungi and algae. That can restrict the flow of water through the pipe and out the drinker. Now, a lot of people think if it's alive, they're going to lump it together. Everything that's alive, I just got minerals and I got things that are living in that water line. But actually, I have separated out the bacteria and the fungus and the algae because you're creating the environment for one of those to grow if you're not keeping up with your water quality. And the different kind of environment you create will determine which one of these is going to grow. You can have bacteria and not have fungus and algae. Or you can have fungus and algae and not have any bacteria. Of course, you can have both. But what you do in that water line today determines which one of those is going to grow. Or hopefully not. So let's talk about those minerals a little bit. What do the minerals actually do? It can affect the feed absorption. Sulfur is a good example of that. Sulfur damages the intestines. Then they can't absorb their nutrients. Changes the taste of the water. Zinc is a great example of that. Zinc, you can't see it. You hold up that water sample and it's clear. You have no idea it's there. But with all the tin roofs we have and the watershed having a tin roof and the facilities having a tin roof and a generator shed that you might have out there that has a tin roof or a storage building with a tin roof, what washes off of those tin roofs when it rains? Zinc. And it leaches down into a shallow well, and over years, decades even, the zinc increases in that water and it starts to taste bitter. And your animals will quit drinking it. They'll back off. So over time, production decreases. You notice that your animals aren't drinking as much water. Sodium plus chloride. There's certain combinations of minerals. Sodium plus chloride can produce diarrhea. Nitrates damage the neural system. The longer you have those animals, the more likely this can occur. Nickel is another one. It damages the heart and the liver. Again, the longer you have those animals, the more likely this can occur. So minerals are a good place to start. When I go out, part of my job was as a cooperative extension agent when I was with the University of Arkansas. And what I would do is when I would go out to a farm, a grower was having issues, couldn't figure out where it was, had taken a lot of steps. Finally, he got into the water. So I would go out there, and the first thing that I would do is just ask questions. What is the source? Are you using city water? Are you using well water? When it gets hot and it's August and you need more water, are you turning on that well at the back of the farm that you hadn't used in a year? Did that get introduced into the system and you don't know what's growing in that? How deep is that source? Do you have a shallow well? Do you have a deep well? A shallow well will be affected by things that are occurring up on the surface. Has someone sprayed manure? Did it rain 3 inches last night? If it rains, leaches through the leaves, changes the pH in your well. That can have a huge effect on your animals, what's leaching down into that well. A deep wells are more likely to have high mineral contents. So what is it that you're giving these animals? You got feed going in there. That feed's been formulated with a certain type of nutrition in it, certain type of minerals in it, and then you come back behind them with this well. Do you know what you're really giving them? So a good place to start, if you don't know anything about your water source, a good place to start is to get a mineral profile of it. There's several places that do it. I know the University of Arkansas can do it for about $19. You get 23 or 26 different minerals to tell you what is in that well. Great place to start. When you get that information, you can see that some are not a problem for the pigs. You can have high calcium, not a problem, but it's a problem for our equipment. Other minerals can be harsh on intestines and prevent proper absorption. Like I said, sulfates is a good example of that, or some of the others that we discussed earlier. And if you do get those reports, there are ways to get answers about, I do have people that get these mineral reports, and then they don't know what to do with it. So some of these universities can walk you through it. University of Arkansas is good with it. I'm glad to help somebody when they get a mineral report, walk them through it. What minerals do you have, and are they causing an issue for your animals? Has there been a drought or flooding? That can certainly affect your well. What's happening next door? Is somebody drilling next door? Did you have a neighbor that put in a new well, hit your aquifer? Do you have a gas company pushing into the shell that's going to affect what your water quality is? You've got a well that's 700-800 feet. I've seen some 1,500 feet that 2 miles down the road, what happened is affecting their water quality. There's no such thing as pure drinking water either. Every one of us is adding something to these animals by the source that we're giving them. Whether it's city water, whether it's, even if you gave them bottled water, there are minerals in that bottled water, and you're adding something else to these animals. Pigs already receive a balanced diet. You come back behind it and add something else. And then certain bacteria, algae, and fungus thrive off of particular minerals. Iron is a perfect example of that. You've got a well with iron in it. You have a high probability that you have the bacteria that uses that iron as an energy source. And so I tell people a good down and dirty way to check for this instead of doing all those tests is if you've got iron and it's orange, and so you know you've got iron, go into that anteroom, go into where you may have a filter in the system, open it up and feel it. And if your filter is just gritty with that iron, then you're going to have to deal with the iron issue, and that's about it. But if it's slimy, then you have the iron bacteria. So then you've got a whole other issue to deal with. So that's just that's one of my most common issues when I go out on a farm is iron and iron bacteria. And there's an example of that calcium buildup. You start with a 3/4 inch line, let's say. If you let that calcium build up, you're down to a 1/2 inch line, and you're trying to get water to these animals when they get big. It's restricting your flow. And I always like to tell people to keep in mind that even though you're on treated water, rural water system, city water, county water, whatever you want to call it, even though you're on treated water, it does not mean that you are in the clear. Those rural water systems are required to have so many parts per million when it leaves their facility, but by the time it gets to the farmer, who's usually at the end of that water line, there is no chlorine left in that water. And so he's on his own again to treat that water. That is city water. So that lets you know that just because you're on city water does not mean you are receiving pure crystalline water. Holding tanks, they're a good way to allow minerals to settle out, but you've also got to keep up with keeping them clean. And we recommend those get cleaned out about once a year. I don't know if y'all deal with concrete tanks much. I see that more in the West, that they've got concrete tanks. But those are interesting. Those have to be cleaned a couple of times a year. Y'all can imagine in the concrete what's living in there. So what can you do about that? I got minerals now, what am I going to do? There's a lot of stuff you can do, and there are a lot of companies out there that can help you with this. You can do filtration, and you can do filtration on a big farm guard at the well, filtering all of the water that comes in, or you can do it on a smaller basis with each barn, just filtering each barn. You can use the sedimentation tanks that I just showed you. And chemical binding. There's several chemicals that will bind up iron, magnesium. So there are things you can do about this if you'll start investigating it. So I want to point out that when you have these animals in these facilities, you have warmth, because you're growing an animal. You got a water source, and there's usually several kinds of food sources. When you've got that, you have the perfect conditions to not only grow that animal, but to grow bacteria. So we've got this closed watering system. And this is a really great system. It's one of the best ones that we're ever going to come up with. It's not an open trough where these animals are drinking out of it. This system has reduced spillage. It's given us drier manure. It's decreased ammonia volatilization, and it eliminates the daily chore of cleaning those troughs. But what we've done by closing this system up is we've forgotten about it. We don't see that water. We know that something's getting a drink. It's getting something out of that nipple drinker. And so we completely forget about it. But what we've got to remember is that every time they get a drink, they're re-inoculating that system. Whatever they've rooted around with, whatever is on their nose, whatever's around their mouth, every time he reaches up, she reaches up to get a drink, she is putting bacteria back in that system. And there are bacteria that travel. E. coli is a perfect example. E. coli has a tail on it. It moves that tail around, and it works its way right back up into the system. So you wind up contaminating the whole system by what each one of those animals is doing at that nipple drinker. Inside that drinking system, there are a lot of crooks and crannies for things to hide. On that left-hand side, you've got one of those nipple drinkers taken apart. That's a lot of places for fungus and algae and yeasts and molds and parasites and viruses and bacteria to hide. And that regulator on the left-hand side there, if I can't find bacteria anywhere else in that system, if I open up that regulator, that's where it will be. That's a great place for bacteria to hide. So there's an example of one of those diaphragms inside one of those water regulators. Now this happened to be a turkey farm. And they had Bordetella over and over again. So we went out to try to help them. We couldn't really find it in the water lines until we opened up that regulator. We found this algae bloom inside the regulator on this diaphragm. Now this was a surprise even for us because you can barely see that, but it said the water lines were less than a year old. So they thought they were doing pretty good. You got lines that are less than a year old. Okay, I'm probably doing okay. And they were on city water. So even for us, this was a little bit of a surprise because less than a year old city water, in a year, you usually don't get this kind of buildup in a diaphragm. We found the Bordetella in that algae bloom, and we started asking questions about their cleaning process. Well, what they had done is they had used a lot of acids. And acid use over time had lowered the pH, of course, and had killed off some bacteria. When you lower pH, you kill some bacteria. But when you lower pH, you create the perfect environment for several of the yeasts and molds and fungi to grow. And that's what had happened. They'd lowered that pH over and over, and they hadn't treated these water lines with anything else, so they had finally gotten an algae bloom. Not only had they created a great environment for the algae and the fungus, but they had killed off all their competition. They'd killed off all the bacteria. So these just bloomed. So that brings me to talk about the difference between an algae bloom and a biofilm and what you're actually dealing with in these water lines. Previous slide demonstrated obvious algae bloom. You can see it. It's gross. It's green. It's nasty. Easily visually detected. But a biofilm is often clear, and sometimes they're slimy and gross, but sometimes they're hard. And they look like part of the pipe. The plaque on your teeth is a biofilm. And you can get in there, and it's not, you open that up and you look in, you don't necessarily see it. You think you're going to look in there and you're going to see a biofilm. But different bacteria produce different kinds of biofilms. And so you're not always going to know it's there. Highest count I ever got on a farm came from squeaky clean pipes. The grower insisted his pipes were clean. That's not where his problem was. I tested the lines, highest count I ever got, because he had a bacteria in there that had built this plaque up in this water line. And you couldn't tell. So there's a typical biofilm, how it builds up on that pipe. If you're not treating water lines in the facilities you've got right now, you are building a biofilm in there. It takes very little nutrients. It causes health challenges from one production cycle to the next. Harbors disease agents like E. coli, like I've already talked about, and Salmonella and Listeria and Campylobacter, and they're all in there. And once established, it is 10 to 1,000 times harder to remove. And what I mean is that once it attaches itself to that pipe, it gets to be a booger to get it off. Those in the middle, floating around in the middle, pretty easy to kill. But once it attaches to that pipe, it becomes really difficult. And it repopulates in 2 or 3 days. If we do a poor job of removing it in the first place, and we've got splotches of it in there, when we don't treat the water during grow out, and when we add a food supply to these water lines, and we do that all the time. These are some of those food supplies we put in there. We're adding vitamins and electrolytes, organic acids, citric acid, vinegar, all those acids that we add to these water lines, medication, vaccine stabilizers, antibiotics. There's bacteria, yeast, molds, algae that grow on all of that. And I can't tell you the things that I've seen in these water lines. It is amazing. I had a animal production facility that their animals had diarrhea. So they put Pepto-Bismol in the water line. There's stuff that can grow in all beer. I was in Louisiana a couple of months ago. They're putting beer in the water line because it got their animals to eating more. So, and they did. They ate more, you know. But I was there. They had a problem with the water, and that's why. Are we cleaning these lines after we use these products? Are we cleaning these lines even when the facilities are empty? Are you going back behind and cleaning these lines out? You know, it's kind of last on the list. If we've got time, we do. And then we do a great job at just plain adding stuff to these water lines just because we're not watching every part of what's going in. A rat in your medicator bucket is just not going to help you with production. And over here on the left-hand side, the lid. There's no lid on that. So when you've got a bucket sitting there, and what have you got? You've got warmth, you've got water, and you've got a food source. Whatever's in that bucket's a food source. Even bacteria will grow in antibiotics. Antibiotics can be specific for bacteria. So just because you're putting antibiotics in there does not mean that you're killing everything. But you've got the perfect condition in that bucket to grow something. And you get dust and dander and stuff dropping into that bucket without a lid on it, and you are going to have the proliferation of some organisms growing in that bucket. I've had lines jammed shut for the animals just because they weren't watching. They didn't have a lid on that bucket. One Auburn study, let me back up for a second there. For poultry, we have to do this LT vaccine, and some of us do it in the water line. And so we did this vaccine into the water line. Auburn found active, viable LT virus still living in that water line 21 days after we did that vaccination process. So 3 weeks later, we still have virus. We still have vaccine. Active, viable virus caught up in that biofilm because we're not treating that water while those animals are in there, still feeding off virus to these animals. And so they get this rolling reaction, and they can't get better because we're still vaccinating them 3 weeks later because we're not treating the water while these animals are in the barn. So at the University of Arkansas, we decided to give a heads up about some of the most common things that we see in the field. Chlorine, most common choice out there. It's readily used when it enters the system. So chlorine is good for those free-floating bacteria that haven't attached to the pipe yet. It does a good job on that. But once it attached to the pipe, chlorine does not have the oxidation power to cut through a biofilm. So you're going to have something else in that water line or clean those lines when it's empty. Chlorine's not very effective below 65 degrees. A day like today, what do you think that water is coming up out of the well? It's not 65 degrees. So you're treating water at the well with chlorine, it's coming up out of there at 45, 50. You're already ineffective with your chlorine process. It is affected by pH. If you're going to use chlorine, you've got to get it to a low pH. You've got a pH of 8 and you're putting chlorine in, you're wasting your money. You've got to have a pH of 6 or 7 in order for chlorine to be in its most active form. That's what you're looking for, is to change this form to a hypochlorous acid so it's actually killing bacteria. Doesn't penetrate layers of organics. And we saw bacterial resistance. Farmers that had used chlorine over and over and over for years definitely get a bacterial resistance to it. So this is a chart on the pH of water and how it affects that chlorine. I don't like to put a lot of numbers out, but this is one of them that's important if you are using chlorine. Those red bars is the pH range that you need to have if you're going to use chlorine. So you see, you've got to get down there into the 5 or 6 range of pH if you're going to be using chlorine, because you're looking for that form of chlorine that's going to actually kill the bacteria. And acids. Acids are not complete line cleaners. They're great to descale. So if you've got a mineral buildup in that water line, the facility is empty, use a strong acid and it will clean those minerals out. It will descale that water line. Now I know also during high water usage, contact time is minimal. For some of these acids, it takes 15 to 20 minutes to kill a bacteria. And when you've got big animals in there, that water is chucking through that line, you don't have 15 or 20 minutes for it to work on a bacteria. So that's a compromise for acids. And you're going to get fungal blooms. If you're not coming back behind and using something in that water line to treat that water, you are going to get fungal blooms if you use acids over and over. And the other thing I want to say about acids is, I know we're going to use them. When we've got animals that have diarrhea, we give them acids. And we use acids for several other reasons. And I know we're going to use them. They're a great tool. But when you do, you've got to come back behind and treat that water, or at least make sure you're cleaning those water lines when that facility is empty. That was flushed out of a water line. That's an algae bloom. They had used acids over and over and never come back behind and clean those water lines. So they went out one morning and their water lines were clogged, and that's what they got flushed out of it. And that's just a fresh water flush. They're not even cleaning the line. I mean, they just put the power flush on. Those are tubes of biofilm that got blown out of a line with an air compressor. And you just got to make sure that you're coming back behind and cleaning the water lines when those facilities are empty. That'll clog your water lines up, and your animals aren't going to get water. You don't want to come out in the morning and have that happening. And besides the fact, what's living in that? What's been shedding off to those animals for the past year, making them sick, making them have to fight this instead of using their energy to grow? So what goes in the line can determine what grows in the line. And that is a Pseudomonas issue that this grower had. It's gunky. It was down in the nipple drinkers. It had clogged the nipple drinkers up. And what had happened is he had gotten Pseudomonas from the environment itself. It had gotten into the water line from the animals getting a drink. And he had the perfect environment for it. He was putting food in there. He had several things he was putting in there. He was acid, and he was putting iodine, thinking that he was helping his water lines. But the Pseudomonas had gotten resistant to it. And Pseudomonas is a booger to get out of that water line. I mean, it's got cilia on it, and it's one of those that if it gets introduced in the barn, it will actually work its way back through the system and into your well. And you think it's not going to get through that filter in the ante room, but it is an amazing little organism, and it will get back in your well. So, you get Pseudomonas, you got some cleaning to do. You got to use a product that's designed for cleaning. I just wanted to show people, and this was it when I was with the university, we wanted to show people the difference between using a product that is not really designed for cleaning and using one that's specific for it. So on the left-hand side, we have a line that's been cleaned with an acid. And on the right-hand side, we have a line that's cleaned with an appropriate line cleaner. That is the same line on the right-hand side. That's the same line as the acid one. It's just the next day. We just came back behind it. So that shows you all the gunk that came out of the one on the right-hand side, shows you what the acid left behind. Just use a product that's appropriate for cleaning those lines. How do you do that? How do I clean water lines? I had a lane for operation that had an AI issue. And they came through, shuts farm down, lost all his birds. They came through, the state officials came through and had contracted with this company to clean his facility. He went through and they cleaned the facility. They were there in biohazard suits, and they had the masks on and the boots and everything. And they sprayed down the walls, and they cleaned the floors and all of that bit. And so it wound up costing $1 million. And the grower was really interested in what cost so much. So he got an itemized list of it, and he was going through that itemized list, and he saw what they'd done to the walls and the things that they had taken out of the facility and how careful they had been, but he never did see waterline cleaning on there. So he went to one of them and he said, "You've cleaned everything in this barn except the inside of those water lines." And they said, "Yeah, we just didn't know how." So I'm going to teach y'all how. Water line cleaning. When those facilities are empty, power flush the lines to remove sediment and loosen heavy soils. Prepare the system to add a water line cleaner. Be sure to follow label instructions for use and safe handling. Take note of the proper concentration of whatever product you're using. Too little product can be a waste of time and money. So this is the biggest mistake that I see when people start trying to clean their water lines. This is the biggest mistake, is they will take the doser that they put in medications with, and they'll just stick it in a jug of whatever it is they're using. Now those dosers are a 1 to 128. So that is a 0.78% solution. Most of the products on the market call for a 2% or a 3% solution. So you're not even getting a 1% in there when you're cleaning and the facilities are empty. So you got to use something besides your doser. They have these things called proportioner pumps, and there's several on the market. My company has one called a Quick Blend. There's also an Easy Mix. I think there's a Quick Mix. There's several of them out there, but they're proportioner pumps, and they're different than your medicator. They are just for when the facility is empty. They have a special tip on them that allows the uptake of a certain percentage of product, so you know you're getting a 2 or 3% solution in there, and they're easy to use. All you have to do is unscrew the hoses on your medicator, screw in the hoses from the proportioner pump, drop that. You can drop down in the jug, so you don't have to make a stock solution. And then you can just turn your water lines on, and it takes in the proper percentage for you. I started out using a sump pump. I would fill a 30-gallon barrel, Rubbermaid barrel, with water, and I would put in a gallon of what I was using, which makes it a 3% solution. And I'd drop a sump pump in there and connect it directly to the water lines and just fill those water lines up. I know a lot of people vaccinate that way too. So that's a good way to clean those water lines and get the right percentage. Oh, yeah, there's the sump pump. And you see, I've bypassed the doser there completely. I'm going straight into that water line with my hose, so I know I'm getting a 3% solution in there. Cleaning when facilities are empty is essential. There are methods to treat waters while the animals are in the facilities. If you need a method, ask me about it. I can give you a couple of ways to treat water while animals are in the facility. I'll be glad to talk you through that. It's vital in the nursery, though. And I'll tell you, that's where you see the biggest production benefit, is in the nursery. You've got slow water while these babies are small. You've got high temperature while you're trying to keep them warm. And you've got them hitting drinkers all the time. And so that continuous feed of hitting the drinkers in the nursery is vital. Additives always need to be followed by effective water treatment. First few weeks can make or break performance. Like I said, slow-moving water, the barn is warm, the pigs continuously inoculate the same water over and over. So how important is water quality to you at this point? It's pretty important. Clean water lines mean quality animals. Farms that have implemented a regular cleaning program regularly report to me. They've got improved performance, lower death loss, fewer challenges. And when it's all said and done, you're adding another nutrient to these animals. Not just the feed, not just what you're putting in with that doser, but what you're pulling up from your well and what's coming in from your city is changing how these animals perform. We can control how clean the water is we give our pigs. Totally up to you how clean that water line is. Quality water can be an easy, inexpensive way to grow a better, healthier pig. Keep it simple. That's one of the things I would do when I go out to a grower and he was having water issues. First thing I'd have him do is get off of everything. They're putting all kinds of stuff in these water lines, especially on the poultry side when they're trying to go antibiotic free. I got all kinds of herbs and probiotics and everything going into these water lines. So I just take them off all of it. You just want clean water for these animals. More is not always better with the water treatment program. Your pigs are going to tell you if your water program's right. You'll see it. Your pigs will respond to that. And the ultimate question is, are you confident enough in what you're doing on your farm that you'll go to the end of the water line and take a drink of that water? And that'll tell you if you're doing the right thing for these animals.